In today's video, you're going to learn everything you need to know regarding the Promise.race method within JavaScript. We're first going to go over a conceptual explanation of how this method works. Then we're going to cover some examples to kind of make things a little bit more clear. And then we're going to discuss some differences between Promise.race and Promise.any, Promise.all, and Promise.all_settled, the other promise methods that are useful within JavaScript. So first things first, what is Promise.race? Well, Promise.race is a method on the overall promise object. So you get a promise object within JavaScript that you can use for free. And Promise.race is a method that you can access on this object. And Promise.race will take one argument. And this will be an array or an iterable containing promises. So you pass an array of promises to the Promise.race method. And what this method will do is it will resolve or it will return a promise. And more specifically, it will return the first promise that either fulfills or rejects within your input array of promises. So you pass it this input array of promises, and the very first promise to either fulfill or reject, hence the name race, there's a race for the first promise to either fulfill or reject, and whichever promise either fulfills or rejects first, the Promise.race method will return a promise representing whatever promise either fulfilled or rejected first. Okay, so let's dive into an example here to make things a bit more clear. So in my example here on line 16, I have a promise that I create, and it's called Promise1. And I assign the constant Promise1 to a new promise. So I use the new keyword and I invoke the overall promise constructor function, and I effectively create a promise that is going to reject after 100 milliseconds. So this code here is going to create a promise that rejects after 100 milliseconds with the value of quick. And then on line 18, I do something very similar in which I assign a constant promise2 to a new promise. And this is effectively going to create a promise that resolves after 500 milliseconds with a value of slow. So knowing what you know about the Promise.race method, what do you think is going to happen when I take my promises array here and I pass it into Promise.race? Well, it's going to return a promise representing the first promise here that either fulfills or rejects. And in this case, the first promise that either fulfills or rejects is going to be Promise1 with the value of quick. So since Promise.race returns a promise, you can handle that promise with the .then method, just like what I do here. And then here I just console log the value. And similarly, since it returns a promise, I can also handle it with the .catch method. So if a promise resolves, we're going to enter this .then block. And if a promise rejects, we're going to handle this .catch block. So in this example here, since Promise1 is set to reject after 100 milliseconds, which is going to be before Promise2 here, set to resolve after 500 milliseconds, I would expect this Promise.race method to handle its catch block here and console log the value of quick, because this Promise1, it will reject before Promise2 has the time to resolve. So if I run my code here, you're going to see that I console log quick because I'm console logging the rejected promise here because it rejects after 100 milliseconds. Now, if I switch this to 700 milliseconds, well, now Promise1 is going to reject after Promise2 resolves here. So if I run this code, you see that I console log slow because now Promise2 is actually going to resolve ahead of Promise1. So Promise.race is going to return a promise representing Promise2 here because it's going to resolve first. So the Promise.race method within JavaScript, it takes an iterable or an array of promises, and then it is going to return a promise. And this promise that is returned by Promise.race is going to represent the very first promise that either resolves or rejects within your passed in promise array, and then it's going to ignore all other promises within that array, and there's just that race for the first promise to come back. It is going to return that within this method. Now, how is this different from the other promise methods? Well, when looking at the difference between promise.race and promise.any, it's actually very similar, in which promise.any, it's going to return the first promise that resolves. However, promise.any actually ignores rejected promises. So promise.any works the same way as promise.race, except it only works for resolved promises. So in this example here, if I have this promise to reject after 100 milliseconds, well, promise.race, we saw that it returns promise 1 here. But if I change this to promise.any, we're actually going to see that it ignores the rejected promise, and it's still going to return the first promise that resolves. Now, the difference between promise.race and promise.allSettled is promise.allSettled is going to wait for all of your promises within your passed-in array to fulfill or reject, and then it's going to return an array of values representing those fulfilled or rejected promises. So promise.allSettled, it'll wait for all the promises to kind of all fulfill or reject. And then the difference between promise.race and promise.all is that promise.all, it will wait for all fulfilled promises to kind of settle, and then it will return an array representing the value of all the promises that resolve. However, with promise.all, if any promise rejects, then it's just going to reject immediately, and it's not going to wait for all other promises to resolve. Okay, so that is promise.race within JavaScript and the differences between some of the other promise methods. So stay tuned for more videos on asynchronous JavaScript and other tutorials helping you within your kind of web development learning. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you in that next one.